So the first person I'd like to introduce is Allan Jeffery, and he's represented the Green Party on the site stakeholders group for the A and B stations at Hinkley for the last few years. He's campaigned on anti-nuclear issues with Stop Hinkley for over 30 years, and that was including the original Hinkley C inquiry in the early 80s. He's taught science in secondary schools in Somerset for 25 years, and he's one of the assistant coordinators of the Stop Hinkley campaign. And he's focused particularly on the scientific and technical consequences involved in nuclear power. So over to Allan Jeffery. Okay, thank you.
Good evening. The first slide I've got up here tonight reminds us all that radioactive nuclear waste is a worldwide problem for the nuclear industry and for all the people in the world. Tonight, though, I want us to consider how this radioactive waste affects us here in Somerset, now and into our children's future. In Somerset, on the North Coast, we have two nuclear power plants, Hinkley A and Hinkley B, looking across the Severn Estuary to Wales. Both are old British designs of gas-cooled reactors built and paid for by the taxpayers. On the left you've got Hinkley A. The two blue buildings, one of the early Magnox design that generated electricity from 1965 on and off for about 35 years and was forced to close in the year 2000 for safety reasons. Now it's the job of the government's National Decommissioning Authority to start the long process of trying to decommission the station. Over 100 years programme. On the right, the large pale building is Hinkley B. This is an example of the second generation of British nuclear reactors, and it's still working on a life extension. Its planned generating life has already been extended by EDF and the government, and this reactor is now showing signs of its old age. The graphite core is starting to crack up, and these safety factors will limit how much longer it can be run for. That was the present reactors. This is the proposed new Hinkley C reactor. Our government wants to build two of the most powerful reactors in the world as Hinkley C on the site next to the old reactors. These are a French design called the EPR, the European Pressurized Water Reactor. They're water-cooled, one of the new third generation of reactors. This is supposedly more fuel efficient, and it claims to be a much safer design. But these features themselves have made them the most expensive in the world, and virtually unconstructible. The ones that are being built have suffered long construction delays and huge building costs. Despite 4 of these reactors being constructed over 10 years, none of them are yet working anywhere in the world. All nuclear reactors, whether they're in submarines or nuclear power plants, during the fission process, turn the uranium fuel into 2 main products. 1, heat energy, and 2, less talked about, is the radioactive waste. You can't have one without the other. The heat energy, as we know, is used to boil water, to make steam, to spin turbines and generators and make electricity. But don't forget, 2/3 of this heat energy is thrown away and wasted in the Severn Estuary. Less talked about, of course, is the radioactive waste. This is the resulting mixture of radioactive isotopes which are produced after splitting the uranium atoms. These are toxic and harmful to all living things as they give off ionizing radiation, which must be kept out of our air, our water and our food. This slide shows where if you get ionizing radiation isotopes entering our bodies, they can cause long-term health damage. This picture is on the seats, you may see it. I'm not going to go into the health issues here tonight at the moment. Now, at nuclear power plants, what is radioactive waste? It comes in three main forms. One, spent uranium fuel. Two, all the used materials that have become radioactively contaminated. And three, gases and liquid emissions. Let's take number one, the spent uranium fuel. The uranium fuel is removed from the reactors when it's no longer efficient, and they have to replace it with new fuel. This spent fuel is highly radioactive for thousands of years and very, very hot. Number two, radioactively contaminated materials can be anything from clothing and tools that have been used, right up to the steel and the concrete of the buildings themselves. They all form radioactive waste. Thirdly, there are radioactive gases and liquids. These are emissions that are continually being emitted from the working reactors into the air and the Severn estuary. They are adding to our background natural ionizing radiation. The next speaker will talk about these in a lot more detail. Now, the government categorises waste into three different groups. The first group is the high-level active waste. This gives off high levels of dangerous radioactivity, it's very hot, and it needs to be continuously cooled in either wet or dry storage facilities. In Britain, we store most of our high-level waste entirely in water-filled cooling ponds, which, as you can see, could be very vulnerable to terrorists. This pond here is a 60-year-old cooling pond at Sellafield, and some of you who have been reading the news over the last year may have realised that the public have got very concerned about this very old cooling pond storing this waste, which could be very hazardous for us all in the future. In the USA and parts of Europe, the high-active radioactive waste is not put in wet storage but dry storage, as shown here. Instead of the water cooling it, it's cooled by natural convection of the air. There's only one place in this country where they are going to use this. That's at Sizewell in Suffolk, because our pressurised water reactor there, they've run out of space for the high-active waste in the cooling ponds. Some planning problems there. And instead, they're going to build something like this for dry storage. Otherwise, they'll have to stop Sizewell Nuclear Power Station. That's the high-active waste. Then the government talks about intermediate-level waste. Intermediate-level waste, this also gives off dangerous levels of radiation for long periods of time, but it doesn't give off the heat, so it doesn't need to be continuously cooled. It still, though, has to be securely packaged for long periods of time. This slide shows some intermediate-level waste sealed in cement or grabbed in a barrel. Low-level waste. Contaminated materials giving off much lower levels of radiation, which decay in relatively short periods of time, are treated in several different ways. Some are just incinerated into the air. Some are dissolved in liquids and diluted and dispersed into the environment, into the Severn estuary. Some are containers and stored in waste compounds. The government is causing us a lot of concern because of these large volumes of low-level waste. We're trying to find ways of just storing this waste in public landfills rather than more expensive technical sites. So what's been happening to the waste from our A and B station? During their working lives, the A and B station spent fuel is normally, when it comes out of the reactors, is stored for 90 days in cooling ponds until it is safe enough to be packaged in cooled concrete transport flasks. Here you can see in this photograph, you can see the fuel in the cooling ponds below the B station, Hinkley B station. These flasks are taken to Bridgewater by lorry. Here you can see a transporter with the old style flask in Rosebery Avenue, behind Bridgewater Station. At Bridgewater Station, this hazardous waste is loaded by crane into railway trucks within, dare I say, 100 metres of Eastover Primary School. They are then reversed, the trucks are reversed into the main station, exposing the public to a dose of gamma radiation as they stand on the platforms, before starting their journey all the way up to Sellafield in Cumbria. Here you can see the spent fuel flasks passing through Bristol on the long journey north to Sellafield in Cumbria for reprocessing. Now, all the fuel in the A station was removed over several years when it was closed. But regular train journeys still continue each week, carrying the spent fuel from the B station. It's also worth remembering that during the Olympic Games, movements of trains carrying this dangerous nuclear waste through London were cancelled for the period of the Games, in case, because of the fears about possible terrorist attacks. If you think of the damage that could come from an urban area of a terrorist attacking one of those trains. This is the final destination of the spent fuel from the A and the B stations. This is the cooling ponds at Sellafield. These provide long-term storage before reprocessing to separate the plutonium, uranium and high active waste. As Hinkley A is being decommissioned, the National Decommissioning Authority is trying to reduce the volumes of all the intermediate waste, trying to pack it into yellow boxes, cast iron boxes like these, to go into a temporary waste store on site at Hinkley. Presently, Magnox are reviewing their packaging and they're considering cheaper concrete storage containers. That yellow container there is about £300,000, whereas the concrete ones that they used to use in the old days of Nyrex are only £20,000. So they've got to do a lot of careful separation and decision making. Eventually, the intermediate level waste at Hinkley will be stored in a special waste store similar to this one. This is the intermediate level waste store at Oldbury. How big it is depends on how much they can package the intermediate waste. The low-level waste from Hinkley, the solid low-level waste, is packaged and sent by train to the National Store at Drigg in Cumbria. Here's a photograph showing the large area where all the National Power Station, nuclear power stations send their solid low-level waste. This site is on the coast the Environment Agency is concerned that rising sea levels will mean that the coastal erosion of this site is possible within 100 years. So what about this proposed Hinkley Sea site? What are they going to do with the waste there? Now, this is a map. This is a map showing a plan of the proposed Hinkley Sea site. Take a look at those green boxes there at the top. The spent fuel stores. And just above that, less than 50 metres away, is the sea. Dealing with radioactive waste at Hinkley Point C is a totally different kettle of fish to the legacy waste from the A and B stations. Because the EPR uses fuel twice as enriched and kept for twice as long in the reactors, the spent fuel is much hotter and much more dangerous to handle and package than the legacy fuel from the A and the B stations. This fuel will have to be cooled and kept safe at Hinkley, initially for 10 years cooling, and then stored on site for at least 100 years in these cooling ponds, just less than 50 metres from the sea. Compare this with the 90 days of cooling in the A and the B stations spent fuel, which was then sent up to Cumbria. And it was Cumbria's long-term problem. So, at Hinkley C, Somerset will become a high-level radioactive waste store, possibly the Sellafield of the southwest, for hundreds of years. This picture just shows, you can see the two big buildings there. Those two buildings there are the long-term store for high active waste. And you can see it's only a short distance from the sea, and the tide's out at the moment, but in the winter the sea's right up to that sea wall and going over the top. The government calls this temporary storage, a few hundred years, until a national geological disposal facility is built. Basically, one of these is a deep hole in the ground to hide away the nation's high and intermediate level radioactive waste out of sight. But no GDF for storing radioactive waste safely for thousands of years has been built anywhere in the world. And where would you build one in the UK? The government has been trying to plan for this over the last 60 years and is still no closer to siting and building one. Here's a photograph I took outside the site where the proposed Hinkley C power station is, looking back on the A station and the B station. Is Hinkley a sensible place to build a permanent radioactive waste store? Climate change is causing increasing extreme stormy weather and rising sea levels. The Severn Estuary is the second highest tidal range in the world. And Hinkley Point is very vulnerable to tidal flooding and coastal erosion. That's the A station, that's the B station. This is the seafront, the shore, in front of where the start of the Hinkley Sea will be. Notice that's the sea wall that was built originally to protect the B and the A station. Look how the sea storms in the winter have thrown up the rocks and pebbles higher than the original sea wall. We've got rising sea levels coming with climate change. And you can see there, they had to build an extra 4-metre high Gabion wall in the 1980s because of this. This site is very vulnerable to tidal flooding and excessive rainfall coming down from the mountains. If you look here, this tidal insurgence here, there's all this tidal flooding, was in 1981. radioactive waste store for hundreds of years. Finally, Stop Hinkley believe that the radioactive waste sums up all the problems of the nuclear electricity. The more we use nuclear reactors, the more radioactive waste we produce. Nuclear waste pollutes the living environment and is a threat to us and to our future generations. The costs of keeping this nuclear waste safe and secure are an ever-increasing financial burden on us and our children's children. We must stop producing more nuclear radioactive waste. It's not safe, it's not cheap, and it's not necessary.